The Galactic Council exiled Earth. Humanity smiled and moved beyond. The alarm in my chest starts before the alarm in the room does. My hands are flat on the cold table, and the translator bead in my ear is already humming with the voice of the High Delegate before I have even caught my breath. I am Laura Whitfield, Senior Liaison of the Earth Mission, and I am about to watch my entire species get thrown out of the only community of worlds we have ever known. Around me, 11 alien delegations sit in a slow circle of light. Their eyes, or the things that pass for eyes, are all pointed at me. I feel like a single candle standing in a room full of cold stone statues. The High Delegate, a tall being named Corvin Ashai, rises from his seat, and the chamber goes silent in that particular way that only happens right before something terrible is said. "Representative Whitfield," Corvin says, and his voice is smooth, almost kind, which somehow makes it worse. The Council has reached its decision regarding the status of Earth and its colonies. My pulse is loud in my own ears. I already know what is coming. I heard the rumors 2 days ago from a friendly contact in the records office. But hearing a rumor and hearing the verdict spoken out loud in front of the whole galaxy are two very different things. Effective immediately, Corvin continues, Earth is removed from the Galactic Compact. All trade privileges are revoked. All defense guarantees are withdrawn. All shared technology licenses are cancelled. Earth and its colonies will no longer be recognized as a member species. All trade privileges. Just a strange, heavy stillness. Like the whole room is holding its breath to see how I will react. I think about all the reasons they gave. Reckless expansion. Unregulated energy research. Emotional instability. Words that sound official but really just mean one thing. We frightened them. Humanity grew too fast, built too much, dreamed too big, and the Council decided the safest thing to do was cut us loose before we grew any further. I could argue. I have the right to speak before the ruling is finalized. I open my mouth, and for a moment I almost do argue, out of pure habit, because that is what a diplomat is trained to do. Then I stop myself. I look at the delegates one more time, at their careful, satisfied faces, and I realize something. They are waiting for me to beg. They want to see fear. So instead, I do something that surprises even me. I smile. Not a big smile, just a small, calm one. The kind of smile you give someone when they think they have taken something from you, but you already know they haven't. Corvin blinks, and for the first time since I walked into this chamber, I see a flicker of confusion cross his face. "Representative Whitfield," he says slowly, "do you understand the ruling?" "I understand it completely," I say, and my voice comes out steadier than I expected. "Earth is no longer bound by the compact." "Correct." "Then, Earth is also no longer bound by your rules," I say. "Thank you, Delegate. That will be all." I turn and walk out of the chamber before anyone can respond. My legs are shaking with every step, but my face stays calm, because I know every camera drone in that room is recording this moment, and I know it will be replayed across a dozen worlds by tomorrow. Outside, the corridor is long and quiet, lit by strips of pale blue light. My assistant, a sharp young man named Daniel Cross, is waiting for me near the shuttle bay, his tablet clutched against his chest like a shield. "Well?" he asks, though I can tell from his face he already knows. "We're out," I say. He exhales slowly. "So what happens now? Do we send a formal protest? Request a review hearing? I can have a draft ready in an hour." I shake my head and start walking toward the shuttle. No protest, no review hearing. "Laura, they just cut us off from everything. Trade routes, technology sharing, defense treaties. Every colony we have is suddenly unprotected." "I know exactly what they did," I say, "and I mean it. I have read every line of that ruling twice already. But think about what they were actually protecting us from before today." Daniel frowns, struggling to keep up with me. "Chaos, war, ourselves according to them." "No," I say, "they were protecting themselves from us. From what we might become if nobody was allowed to slow us down." We reach the shuttle, and I strap myself into the seat, still feeling the weight of everything that just happened settle into my bones. Daniel sits across from me, watching me carefully, like he is trying to figure out whether his boss has finally cracked under pressure. "You don't seem upset," he says. "I'm not upset," I answer, and it is the truth. Underneath the shaking hands and the pounding heart, there is something else growing in me, something warm and steady, like the first light of morning after a very long night. "I think I'm relieved." "Relieved," he repeats, like the word tastes strange in his mouth. "Think about it, Daniel. For 60 years, every reactor design we built had to be approved by a council review board that took, 4 years on average? Every ship engine we designed had a speed cap written into its firmware because they were worried we would move faster than they were comfortable with. Every colony charter had to be submitted, translated, argued over, and usually cut down before it was approved. That's how the compact works," Daniel says. "Shared oversight, shared safety. Shared oversight for everyone else, too," I say. "But somehow, it was always our proposals that took the longest. Always our research that got flagged as risky. Always our colonies that had population caps written into the fine print." Adequate. The shuttle lifts off, and through the window I watch the council station shrink behind us, its curved silver structure catching the light of a distant sun. "They didn't exile us because we were dangerous," I say quietly, mostly to myself now. "They exiled us because we were close to catching up to them, and they didn't like how that felt." Daniel is quiet for a moment, turning that thought over. "So what do?" I look at him, and for the first time since I walked into that chamber, I let my calm little smile grow into something bigger, something real. "We do what humans have always done when someone tells them they can't," I say. "We build anyway." The trip back to Earth takes 11 days at standard compact-approved speeds, which, I remind myself with a strange little laugh, no longer apply to us. I spend most of the journey reading through old research files that have been sitting in restricted folders for years, projects that were quietly shelved because they exceeded council guidelines, reactor designs that were too efficient, drive systems that were too fast, materials that were too strong for what the council called civilian use. None of those restrictions mean anything anymore. By the time we reach orbit around Earth, I expect chaos. I expect emergency broadcasts, panicked crowds, government leaders scrambling to explain to the public what just happened. Instead, when I finally get a signal through to the surface, what I see on the news feeds stuns me more than the verdict itself did. People are cheering. Not everywhere, and not everyone. There is worry too, plenty of it, especially among older generations who remember what it was like before the compact, when Earth stood completely alone, with no allies at all. But scrolling through the feeds, I see something I did not expect. I see engineers online joking about finally being able to publish their real numbers. I see a small research lab in Nairobi announcing, with obvious excitement, that they are restarting a fusion project that was shut down 8 years ago for exceeding output limits. I see a colony administrator on Europa Station recording a message that simply says, "We are still here, we are still building, and now nobody gets to tell us how fast we're allowed to do it." I sit in my quarters aboard the shuttle, watching clip after clip, and I feel that same strange warmth from the council chamber spreading through my chest again. They thought exile was a punishment. They thought cutting us off would leave us small and afraid, scrambling back to their door within a year, asking to be let back in on whatever terms they chose to offer. They had no idea what they had just done. They had just taken the leash off, and somewhere out among the stars, quietly, calmly, without a single riot or a single desperate plea, humanity was already starting to smile. The first thing I notice when I finally step off the shuttle onto Earth's soil is how normal everything looks. No riots in the streets, no lines outside government buildings, no panic on the faces of the people walking past me in the transit terminal. If I had not just come from the council chamber myself, I would never have guessed that our species had been cut loose from the rest of the galaxy less than 2 weeks ago. Daniel follows close behind me, still glued to his tablet, scrolling through reports that keep coming in faster than either of us can read them. "You need to see this," he says, holding the screen up as we walk. Every major research center on the planet has filed for what they're calling emergency reclassification. Basically, they're all asking permission to unlock projects that were frozen under council restrictions. Asking permission from who? I ask. He pauses, realizing the answer at the same moment I do. From nobody. There's nobody left to ask. I let out a small laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and surprised. Exactly. We take a transport to the Unified Earth Assembly Building, a tall structure of glass and pale stone that sits at the center of what used to be called Geneva. I am expecting an emergency session filled with fear and blame. Instead, when we walk into the main chamber, I find something closer to a celebration than a crisis meeting. Representatives from every continent are gathered, but instead of arguing, most of them are comparing notes. A woman named Priya Marsh, head of the Global Science Council, is standing near a display wall covered in charts, talking animatedly with a cluster of engineers about drive efficiency numbers. An older man I recognize as the Secretary of Colonial Affairs, Edmund Locke, is laughing with a group of colony administrators about something on his tablet. Priya spots me and waves me over, her face lit up with the kind of energy I have not seen from her in years. "Laura, you made it back," she says, pulling me into the group. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the reactor project." "The one that got flagged for exceeding safe output limits?" I ask. "The very one," she says, grinning. "Turns out our numbers were never wrong. The council just didn't want anyone producing that much clean energy that quickly. Slows down dependence on their trade networks, apparently." I glance around the chamber again, at the maps being pulled up on display walls, at engineers sketching new ship frames on tablets, at colony leaders discussing expansion plans that would have taken years to get approved under the old system. "How long has this been going on?" I ask. "Since about an hour after the verdict was announced," Edmund says, walking over with a cup of something warm in his hand. "People didn't wait for instructions from the top, Laura. Labs across the planet just started pulling their old restricted files and picking up exactly where they left off. Nobody organized it, it just happened. I think back to what I told Daniel on the shuttle, about humans building anyway, and I realize I had underestimated just how true that would turn out to be. Over the next several weeks, I watched the quiet exodus begin in earnest. It does not look like the kind of thing that makes for a dramatic news story. There are no grand speeches, no gathering of fleets in orbit with flags waving. Instead, it looks like thousands of small decisions made all at once, all across the planet and its colonies, by people who no longer feel like they need permission to move forward. I am assigned by the Assembly to track and report on what they are calling the outflow, the wave of new construction, new colonies, and new trade agreements happening entirely outside any council framework. It becomes my job to make sense of numbers that keep climbing faster than anyone expected. In my first month on the assignment, I document 17 new colony charters filed by independent guilds, groups of engineers, scientists, and settlers who pool their resources and simply go, without waiting for years of review. One of them, a young colony leader named Grace Holloway, contacts me directly from a newly settled system 3 jumps beyond what used to be the edge of council-approved space. "We didn't need anyone's approval to come out here," she tells me over the comm link, her voice bright with the kind of excitement I have not heard in a long time. "We just needed a ship, a plan, and people willing to work. That's it. That's all it ever should have taken." I ask her if she is worried about safety, about defense, about all the things the council used to promise to provide. She laughs, not unkindly. "Laura, the council never protected us from anything. They protected their trade routes from us. Out here, we look out for each other. That's always been enough." I start keeping a private file of moments like this, conversations that stick with me long after I log off the comm. A fusion engineer in Lagos, who tells me his new reactor design produces triple the output of anything the council ever approved, and it has been running safely for 6 weeks straight. A shipyard in the asteroid belt that launches its first unrestricted drive vessel and clocks travel times that used to be considered theoretically impossible under council physics guidelines. A trade cooperative on Mars that strikes a direct deal with a neighboring alien mining outpost, cutting out 3 layers of council-mandated middlemen and doubling profits for both sides within the first month. None of it is loud, none of it is angry. It just keeps happening, quietly, steadily, like water finding its way downhill, no matter how many walls someone tries to build in its path. About 2 months after the verdict, I am called into a private meeting with Edmund Locke and a small group of assembly leaders. The room is smaller than the main chamber, more like a study than a hall of government, with tall windows looking out over the city. "We need someone to start managing outside contact," Edmund tells me, sliding a data slate across the table. "Now that we're not bound by council communication protocols, other species are reaching out to us directly. We need a steady hand handling it." I glance at the slate. There are already a dozen incoming requests listed, from species I recognize and a few I do not. "Why me?" I ask. Edmund smiles, and it is not the kind of smile a bureaucrat gives. It is the kind of smile someone gives an old friend. "Because you were in that chamber when they read the verdict, Laura, and instead of falling apart, you smiled. People noticed. That footage is everywhere now, on every world with a functioning news network. You've already become something of a symbol, whether you meant to or not." I did not know the footage from the chamber had spread that far. The thought makes my stomach twist a little, not with fear, but with the strange weight of unexpected responsibility. "What exactly would this role involve?" I ask. "Direct contact," he says, "building relationships with species who are curious about us now that we're outside the compact. No council rules to follow, no forms to file, just you, representing Earth, however you think that should look." I think about Grace Holloway out among the stars, building a colony with nothing but a plan and a willing crew. I think about the engineers unlocking decades of restricted research in a matter of weeks. I think about that small, calm smile I gave the council delegates, and how much has already grown from that single quiet moment. "I'll do it," I say. Over the following weeks, I find myself in more comm calls than I can count, speaking with representatives from species the council always kept at arm's length from us, species who were told humanity was unstable, unpredictable, not to be trusted with open trade or direct diplomacy. Most of them, it turns out, were curious about us the entire time. One of my first real conversations is with a delegate from a species called the Ithran, a slow-moving, thoughtful people known across council space for their skill in materials engineering. Their representative, a calm and careful being named Sovet, reaches out not through any official channel, but through an old trade beacon frequency that used to be reserved for emergencies only. "We were told your species could not be reasoned with," Sovet says, their voice slow and deliberate, "that your ambitions outpaced your wisdom." "And what do you think now?" I ask. There is a long pause, the kind that makes me wonder if the connection has dropped. Then Sovet speaks again. "I think the council feared what it could not control. I think that fear was mistaken for danger. I would like to propose a direct trade discussion, representative to representative, without the council standing between us." I agree immediately, and within days we have the framework for what will become Earth's first fully independent trade agreement, negotiated entirely without any council oversight, review board, or approval process. It is not the last conversation like that one. Species after species begin reaching out, some cautiously, some eagerly, all curious about the world that got exiled and, instead of collapsing, seemed to be quietly thriving. I begin to understand something during this stretch of long calls and late nights reviewing agreements. The exile was never really about protecting the galaxy from Earth. It was about protecting a very careful, very controlled balance of power, one where no single species was ever allowed to grow too quickly, discover too much, or become too capable on its own terms. Humanity broke that balance simply by refusing to be afraid of what came next. Late one evening, after finishing a long call with a trade delegation from a species I had never even heard of before that week, I find myself standing on the balcony outside my office, looking up at a clear night sky filled with stars. Somewhere out there, ships are launching without permission slips. Colonies are growing without population caps. Reactors are humming at outputs the Council once called dangerous, and every single one of them is running just fine. Daniel joins me outside, holding 2 cups of something warm, and hands one to me without a word. "It's strange," he says after a while. "A few months ago, I thought this was the end of something. Now it feels like we're just getting started." I take a slow sip, letting the warmth settle into my hands, and look back up at the stars. "We were never the ones standing still, Daniel," I say. "We were just the ones who finally stopped waiting for permission to move." Behind us, the lights of the assembly building glow steady and bright, filled with people still working late, still building, still reaching outward into a galaxy that told us to stay small and quiet, and got the exact opposite in return. The message arrives on a morning that starts like every other morning has for the past year, quiet, busy, full of comm requests and trade reports stacking up faster than I can answer them. I almost miss it entirely, buried between a supply update from Grace Holloway's growing colony and a routine check-in from Sovet about the materials trade agreement. It is the header that catches my eye first, an unfamiliar council seal attached to a message routed through 3 different relay stations before finally reaching my desk. I open it, and for a moment I simply stare at the words, reading them twice to make sure I am not misunderstanding the formal, careful language. The Galactic Council is requesting a private audience with a representative of Earth. Daniel leans over my shoulder, reading the same lines, and lets out a short, surprised laugh. "They're asking us for a meeting? After everything?" "It looks that way," I say slowly. "We have not spoken directly with anyone from the Council since the day of the verdict. In the year that has passed, Earth has grown so far outside their reach that most days I forget the Council exists at all, tangled up as I am in trade discussions with a dozen independent species, colony reports from systems the Council never bothered mapping, and research updates that keep breaking records the old compact rules never allowed us to approach. I bring the message to Edmund immediately, and by that afternoon I am sitting in front of the full assembly leadership, explaining what little I know. They didn't say why, I tell them, just that they want to speak, quietly, without a formal council session, just one representative on each side. Edmund leans back in his chair, arms crossed, studying the message displayed on the wall behind me. A year ago, they threw us out in front of the entire galaxy. Now they want a private conversation, no cameras, no official record. That tells you something, doesn't it? It tells me they're worried, Priya says from across the table, her earlier excitement about reactor numbers replaced now with something sharper, more focused. You don't ask for a quiet meeting unless you're trying to avoid being seen asking for help. I think about that phrase for a long moment, asking for help. It seems almost impossible, considering how confidently Corvin Ashai stood in that chamber and read our verdict like he was doing us a favor by cutting us loose. "I want you to take the meeting, Laura," Edmund says finally. "You were there for the beginning of this. It feels right that you'd be there for whatever this turns out to be." I agree, though my stomach twists with a mixture of curiosity and something close to nervous anticipation. Before the meeting is arranged, I spend the next 2 weeks gathering everything I can about what has happened across Council space since our exile, piecing together the picture from trade contacts, independent reports, and the occasional cautious message from species like Sovet, who has become something close to a friend over the past year. What I learn paints a very different picture than the one the Council tried to present the day they exiled us. The compact, it turns out, was never as stable as it appeared from the inside. For decades, smaller species had quietly resented the layers of bureaucracy, the endless review boards, the trade restrictions that always seemed to favor whichever species held the most seats on the Council. They stayed quiet because leaving meant losing access to shared defense treaties and trade routes, and no single smaller species had ever been strong enough to walk away and survive on its own. Then Earth did exactly that, loudly, publicly, and successfully. Sovet sends me a message one evening that lays it out plainly. Species who once feared crossing the Council are watching your world closely, they write. You have shown that survival outside the compact is possible. Some are beginning to ask why they continue to pay the cost of membership when the benefits seem to shrink every year. I read that message 3 times before setting it aside, turning the weight of it over in my mind. We were not just building a life outside the compact. We were showing everyone else that the walls around them were never as solid as they had been told. Over the following weeks, more reports filter in confirming what Sophet described. 2 smaller species quietly withdraw from council trade agreements, negotiating instead directly with human colonies for better terms. A shipping guild that used to operate exclusively within council-approved lanes begins routing cargo through independent human trade stations instead, citing faster processing times and fewer restrictions. Even a few individual council member worlds begin sending private inquiries to our new diplomatic office, careful and unofficial, asking about the possibility of direct trade outside the usual channels. The Council's carefully balanced system, the one built on keeping every species dependent on their oversight, is beginning to crack, and Earth's exile is the crack that started it all. When the day of the meeting finally arrives, I travel alone to a small neutral space station, positioned between Council territory and the edge of independent human space, a place chosen specifically because it belongs to neither side. Daniel wanted to come, but I asked him to stay behind this time. Something about this conversation feels like it needs to happen quietly, without an audience, the same way the request itself was made. I am led into a small room with a single table and 2 chairs, nothing like the grand chamber where the verdict was read. When the door opens on the other side, I am surprised to see Corvin Ashai himself walk in, alone, without the usual entourage of aides and record keepers that surrounded him during our last meeting. He looks different than I remember. Older, somehow, though I know very little about how his species ages. There is a tiredness in the way he sits down across from me, folding his hands carefully on the table. "Representative Whitfield," he says, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "Delegate Ashai," I say, keeping my voice even. "It's been a while." "It has," he agrees, and for a long moment neither of us speaks, the silence stretching out between us, heavy with everything that has happened in the year since we last sat across from each other. "I imagine you're wondering why I requested this conversation," he finally says. The thought crossed my mind. He almost smiles at that, though it fades quickly, replaced by something more careful. The Council is facing difficulties it did not anticipate. Trade volume across the compact has declined significantly over the past year. Several member species have begun renegotiating their participation terms. Others have withdrawn entirely. "I've heard," I say simply. "Then you understand the position we find ourselves in," he continues. "Earth's continued success outside the compact has demonstrated something the Council spent decades trying to prevent species from realizing. That membership is a choice, not a necessity." I lean back slightly in my chair, studying him. "You're saying we broke your system just by surviving?" "I am saying," he replies carefully, "that Earth's exile has had consequences the Council did not foresee and did not want." I let that statement sit in the air for a moment before responding. "You're here to ask us back in." Corvin's silence answers the question before he speaks it aloud. The Council is prepared to offer Earth reinstated membership, with adjusted terms, reduced restrictions on research and development, expanded trade quotas, a formal apology for the circumstances of the original ruling. I study his face carefully, looking for the satisfaction I might have expected a year ago, the small victory of hearing the people who exiled us come crawling back with an apology in hand. Instead, what I feel is something quieter, steadier, more like clarity than triumph. "Delegate Ashai," I say slowly, "can I ask you something honestly?" He nods. "When you exiled us, did the Council actually believe we were dangerous, or did the Council simply not like how fast we were catching up?" His jaw tightens slightly, and for a long moment I think he will avoid the question entirely, offer some careful diplomatic non-answer the way officials so often do. Instead, he surprises me. "Both, in a way," he admits quietly. There was genuine concern among some members. But there was also fear, the kind that comes from watching a species grow faster than anyone anticipated, without the patience to wait for permission the way everyone else had learned to. And now, he says, the Council has learned that patience was never the point. Control was, and control, it seems, was never something Earth was willing to accept. I sit with that admission for a long moment, feeling something settle inside me, something that has been unresolved since the day I walked out of that chamber a year ago. I appreciate your honesty, I say finally, but I have to tell you, the offer you're describing, reinstated membership with better terms, isn't something I can bring back to Earth. Corvin's expression shifts, surprise flickering across his features. You would refuse reinstatement entirely? I would refuse rejoining a system built on the idea that some species get to decide how fast others are allowed to grow, I say, and my voice stays calm, steady, the same calm I found the day I smiled at him across that chamber. Earth doesn't need to be let back in. Delegate. We've already built something better outside your walls. He is quiet for a long moment, and I watch something complicated cross his face. Disappointment mixed with something that might almost be respect. Then what does Earth want? He asks finally. I think about Grace Holloway building a colony 3 jumps beyond the old council border, with nothing but a plan and a willing crew. I think about Sovet, who reached out not because of any treaty, but because they were simply curious about who we really were. I think about every independent agreement, every unrestricted reactor, every ship launched without a single form filed with anyone. Partnership, I say. Not membership, not oversight. Direct relationships between Earth and whichever species want to build something with us, on equal terms, without a council standing in the middle deciding what's allowed. Corvin studies me for a long moment, and I can see him weighing the shift in power this conversation represents, the strange reversal of a meeting that started with him offering us readmission and is ending with me offering him something else entirely. I will need to bring this back to the full council, he says finally. I understand, I say, standing from my chair. But I want to be clear about something before I go. Delegate. Earth isn't waiting for the council's approval anymore. We haven't been waiting for a long time. Whatever the council decides, we're going to keep building, keep growing, keep reaching outward toward anyone willing to meet us as equals. That was true a year ago, and it's still true today. I turn toward the door, and as I reach it, Corvin speaks once more, his voice quieter than before. Representative Whitfield. I pause, glancing back at him. For what it's worth, he says, I don't think the council understood what it was truly setting free the day it exiled your world. I feel that small, calm smile return to my face, the same one I gave him a year ago in that chamber full of cold stares. No, I agree. I don't think you did. I walk out of the room and back toward the transport that will carry me home, and somewhere behind me, I imagine the council beginning the long, difficult process of understanding that the leash they cut a year ago was never coming back on, no matter what terms they were now willing to offer. The trip home feels different than any journey I have taken over the past year. I sit in the quiet of the transport cabin, replaying the conversation with Corvin again and again, turning his words over like stones in my hand. The council is struggling. Species are questioning their membership. The system built to keep everyone dependent is beginning to bend under its own weight, and somehow, without ever intending to, Earth became the crack that started it all. When I arrive back at the assembly building, I am met not with a small meeting room this time, but with the full chamber, filled with representatives eager to hear how the conversation unfolded. Edmund stands near the front, arms crossed, watching me carefully as I walk to the podium. Well, he asks, what did they want? I take a breath, letting the weight of the moment settle before I speak. They offered us reinstated membership, reduced restrictions, expanded trade quotas, even a formal apology. A murmur runs through the room, some surprised, some skeptical, a few already leaning forward with cautious hope. And what did you tell them? Priya asks from her seat, though something in her expression suggests she already suspects the answer. I told them no, I say. The murmur grows louder, a mix of gasps and low conversation rippling through the chamber. Edmund raises a hand, calling for quiet, and I continue before the noise can build further. I told them Earth doesn't need to be let back into a system built on control, I say, my voice steady and carrying clearly across the room. I offered them something else instead. Partnership, not membership. Direct relationships with any species willing to work with us as equals, without a council standing between us deciding what we're allowed to build, how fast we're allowed to grow, or who we're allowed to talk to. For a moment, the chamber falls completely silent, and I wonder if I overstepped, if the weight of that decision was mine to make alone, in a quiet room, with a single council delegate. Then, slowly, Edmund begins to clap. It spreads through the chamber like a wave, representatives rising from their seats, applause filling the room until it becomes a steady rolling sound that makes my chest tighten with something between pride and disbelief. "That's the answer I was hoping you'd give," Edmund says once the room settles, a broad smile spreading across his face. "Earth built everything we have now without their permission. It would be a strange thing indeed to hand that independence back over the moment they finally noticed it." Over the following months, the ripple effects of that meeting begin to spread outward in ways none of us fully anticipated. Word travels quickly through independent trade networks that Earth turned down council reinstatement entirely, choosing instead to remain outside the compact on its own terms. The story spreads fastest among the smaller species who have already begun questioning their own membership, and within weeks, my comm queue fills with new messages, cautious inquiries from species who, a year ago, would never have considered reaching out to a world the council had labeled unstable. Sofet is among the first to reach out again, this time with something more than curiosity in their voice. The Ithran Assembly has voted to open formal discussions about our continued council membership, they tell me. Your example weighed heavily in that decision. I feel a strange mixture of pride and responsibility settle over me as more species follow similar paths. A shipping guild formally severs its council trade agreement in favor of direct partnership with human stations. A small mining collective on the edge of council space reaches out asking about the specifics of our independent trade framework, hoping to build something similar for themselves. Even a full member world, a quiet, technologically skilled species called the Vethran, sends a formal delegation requesting to study how Earth structured its independent growth over the past year. Grace Holloway, still leading her colony 3 jumps beyond the old council border, sends me a message one afternoon that makes me laugh out loud at my desk. "We just signed our first trade deal with a species that used to require council mediation for even a simple conversation," she writes. "They said dealing with us directly was refreshing. Apparently we're easier to talk to than an entire review board." I begin to understand over these months that what happened to Earth was never really about exile at all. It was about a single crack appearing in a system that had convinced dozens of species they could not survive without it. And once that crack appeared, it did not take long for others to realize the walls around them had been thinner than they ever imagined. Not everything moves smoothly, of course. There are challenges along the way that test the patience and resolve of everyone involved. A dispute arises over resource rights in a system claimed by both an independent human colony and a smaller species still technically under council jurisdiction, and for a tense 2 weeks, I find myself mediating between 2 sides who have never had to negotiate directly with each other before, without a council review board to fall back on for guidance. It is slow, occasionally frustrating work, but eventually we arrive at an agreement that satisfies both sides, brokered entirely through patience, honesty, and a willingness to listen rather than through layers of bureaucratic procedure. "This is harder than I expected," I admit to Daniel one evening, rubbing my eyes after another long day of careful negotiation. "Harder than dealing with the council?" he asks. I think about that for a moment. "Different," I say finally. The council made things slow, but they also made things predictable. Out here, every agreement has to be built from scratch, with people who don't share our assumptions about how things are supposed to work. "But," Daniel prompts, clearly sensing there is more to the thought, But it's honest, I say. Every agreement we make out here, we make because both sides actually want it, not because a review board forced us into it. That's worth the extra effort. As the months continue to pass, Earth's independent network grows steadily, built one careful relationship at a time. New trade agreements, new shared research projects with species eager to explore ideas the Council once considered too risky to approve. New colonies launched, not with population caps and government oversight, but with willing crews and clear plans, exactly the way Grace Holloway described from the very beginning. Then, nearly 2 years after the day of the original verdict, another message arrives. This time, not a quiet private request, but a formal broadcast sent to every species still remaining within the compact. The Galactic Council has called for a full review of its own governing structure. I read the announcement 3 times, sitting alone in my office late one evening, watching the details scroll across my screen. Reduced trade restrictions across all member species, streamlined research review processes, expanded independence for smaller worlds who wish to negotiate their own external agreements without requiring full council approval. They are not dismantling the compact entirely, but they are loosening the very leash that once tied every member species so tightly to their control, the same leash that was cut from Earth's neck the day they thought they were punishing us. Daniel walks in as I am still reading, and I turn the screen toward him without a word. He reads it slowly, his eyebrows rising higher with each line. "They're reforming the entire system," he says, disbelief coloring his voice. "Because of us." "Not just because of us," I say. "Because we showed everyone else what was possible. The Council can call this a review all they want, but every species reading this broadcast today knows exactly why it's happening." Daniel sits down across from me, shaking his head slowly. "A year ago, they stood in front of the whole galaxy and told the universe we were too dangerous, too unstable, too unpredictable to be trusted. Now their entire system is bending because we refuse to be afraid of standing alone." I look back at the screen, at the careful, formal language trying so hard to disguise what is really happening underneath it. A system built on control, slowly, quietly, coming undone, not because Earth fought against it directly, but because Earth simply walked away and built something better, and everyone else finally noticed. "They thought exile was the end of us," I say quietly, mostly to myself. It was just the beginning of everyone else waking up. The final message arrives on a bright morning, almost 3 years to the day since I stood in that council chamber and watched Corvin Ashai read out our exile with careful, practiced calm. I am at my desk reviewing trade reports from 4 different independent systems when the priority alert flashes across my screen, marked with a seal I have not seen used in over a year, the formal insignia of the full Galactic Council, requesting an open session, not a private meeting this time, but a full gathering with every remaining member species invited to attend. The subject line is simple, a formal invitation for Earth to address the Council. I sit back in my chair, staring at the words for a long moment before calling Daniel and Edmund into my office to see it for themselves. "They want us to speak in open session," Edmund says slowly, reading it over my shoulder. "Not a quiet room this time. The full chamber, cameras and all. After everything that's happened," Daniel adds, "I think they finally understand this isn't something they can handle quietly anymore." Over the past year, the changes within the compact have continued to unfold, slowly at first, then faster as more species pushed for the same freedoms Earth built for itself outside the system. Trade restrictions loosened across nearly every member world. Research review boards were streamlined or dissolved entirely in favor of self-governance. 3 more species formally withdrew from the compact altogether, choosing instead to build independent partnerships the way Earth had shown was possible. The galaxy I am about to walk back into is not the same one that exiled us 3 years ago. I spend the next several days preparing, not with the careful defensive diplomacy I once used as a junior liaison, but with a clear sense of exactly what I want to say. Grace Holloway sends a message of encouragement from her colony, now grown into a thriving system of its own. SOFET sends detailed notes on the current political landscape within the Council, insight gathered from their own species' ongoing negotiations for expanded independence. Even Priya and Edmund spend long evenings with me, helping shape not a request, not an argument, but a simple, honest statement of where Earth stands and where we intend to go from here. When the day finally arrives, I step off the transport onto the familiar Council station, the same one I walked through 3 years ago, with shaking hands and a calm face. This time my hands do not shake. The chamber is exactly as I remember it, the wide circle of seats filled with delegates from every corner of Council space, but the atmosphere feels entirely different. There is no smug satisfaction on the faces around me this time, no quiet anticipation of watching a smaller species crumble under pressure. Instead, I see curiosity, careful respect, and in a few faces, something that looks almost like admiration. Corvin Ashai stands to greet me as I enter, and though his expression remains carefully composed in the way Council delegates are trained to maintain, I notice something different in his posture, something less certain than the confident, controlled figure who once read our exile like a foregone conclusion. "Representative Whitfield," he says, his voice carrying across the chamber, "thank you for accepting our invitation." "Delegate Ashai," I reply, taking my place at the center podium, the same spot where I once stood and listened to the verdict that changed everything. He turns to address the full chamber before continuing. 3 years ago, in this very room, the Council made a decision regarding the status of Earth within the Compact. Today, we have asked Representative Whitfield to speak, not to request reinstatement, but to share Earth's perspective on the changes that have followed since that decision. Fort. A quiet murmur runs through the chamber, delegates leaning forward, and I take a breath, letting the moment settle before I begin. 3 years ago, I say, my voice steady and clear, I stood in this exact spot and listened as this Council declared my species too reckless, too unpredictable, too dangerous to remain part of your community of worlds. I remember every word of that verdict, because I have thought about it nearly every day since. I let my gaze move slowly across the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates I recognize and many I do not. When I walked out of this room that day, I did not know what waited for us. Nobody on Earth did. We had no guarantee of safety, no promise of trade, no protection beyond what we could build for ourselves. And for a little while, I imagine many of you expected exactly what the verdict was designed to produce, a species humbled, frightened, and eager to come crawling back the moment things became difficult. I pause, letting the silence stretch, watching several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. That is not what happened, I continue. Instead, Earth looked at everything we had been told we could not do, every restriction, every cap, every carefully worded limitation placed on our growth in the name of galactic safety, and we simply stopped listening to those limits. Not out of anger, not out of rebellion, simply because we finally understood that those limits were never truly about safety at all. I glance toward Corvin, who watches me with an expression I cannot quite read, somewhere between resignation and quiet respect. In the past 3 years, Earth has built independent trade relationships with over a dozen species, many of whom reached out to us directly, curious about a world that refused to be afraid of standing alone. We have expanded our colonies not through population caps and years of review, but through the simple willingness of people to go, to build, to try. We have developed technology that decades of Council restrictions kept locked away, not because it was dangerous, but because it moved faster than this Council was comfortable allowing any single species to move. I take a breath, feeling the weight of the chamber's attention settle around me, no longer the cold, judgmental silence of 3 years ago, but something closer to genuine listening. I understand why many of you are now reconsidering your own relationship with the Compact, I say. I understand why trade restrictions have loosened, why research boards have been streamlined, why species who once felt trapped within this system are finally finding the courage to ask for something better. Earth did not set out to break this compact. We simply stopped waiting for permission to become who we already were, and it turns out that example was contagious. I look directly at Corvin now, my voice softening slightly, though it loses none of its steadiness. Delegate HFY once asked me, in a quiet room not far from here, what Earth truly wants. I told him then, and I will tell all of you now, we do not want reinstatement. We do not want to be folded back into a system built on control, no matter how gently that control is now being offered. What Earth wants is exactly what we have already built for ourselves. Partnership between equals. Relationships built on mutual respect, not oversight. A galaxy where no single species gets to decide how fast another is allowed to grow. The chamber remains silent for a long moment after I finish, and I wonder, briefly, if I have gone too far, if the honesty of this moment will be met with the same cold dismissal that once defined my relationship with this room. Instead, slowly, a delegate near the back of the chamber rises to their feet. I recognize the markings of the Ithran delegation, and though it is not Sovet standing there, I feel a swell of quiet pride, knowing the connection our two species built together may have helped lead to this moment. The Ithran Assembly, the delegate says, their voice carrying clearly across the chamber, formally withdraws from the Galactic Compact, effective today. We will be pursuing independent partnerships, beginning with continued collaboration with Earth. A ripple of stunned silence follows, and before it can fully settle, another delegate rises, then another, each announcing similar intentions, some withdrawing entirely, others simply demanding renegotiated terms that finally treat their species as full equals rather than dependents to be managed. I watch Corvin HFY standing at the center of a chamber that is quietly, steadily coming apart around him, not through conflict, not through anger, but through the simple, unstoppable momentum of species finally choosing freedom over comfort. When the session finally ends, hours later, I find Corvin waiting for me near the chamber's entrance, his posture tired, but strangely peaceful, like a man who has finally stopped fighting a battle he always knew. Deep down, he could not win. "You didn't come here to save the compact," he says quietly. "Did you?" "No," I admit. "I came here to tell the truth. What happens to the compact after that was never really up to me." He nods slowly, looking out toward the wide windows of the station, where ships from a dozen different species drift past, some still bearing Council registry, many now flying without it. "For what it's worth, Representative Whitfield," he says, "I think history will remember this differently than the Council intended 3 years ago. I think of Grace Holloway's colony, thriving 3 jumps beyond what used to be the edge of known space. I think of Sovet, who reached out simply because they were curious about who we really were. I think of every independent agreement, every unrestricted reactor, every ship launched without a single form filed with anyone, and every quiet, steady decision made by people who simply stopped waiting for permission to build the future they wanted." "I think you're right," I say, offering him one last small, calm smile, the same one I gave him 3 years ago in a chamber full of cold, uncertain stares. "But I don't think it will be remembered as the day the compact fell apart." "Then how will it be remembered?" he asks. I look out past him, toward the stars stretching endlessly beyond the station's wide windows, toward every world now quietly choosing its own path forward, inspired by a single species who simply refused to be afraid of standing alone. As the day everyone finally realized they never needed permission to move beyond, I say, the same day humanity already had. I turn and walk toward the transport that will carry me home, past ships bearing no Council registry, past delegates already deep in quiet conversation about what comes next, past a system built on control finally giving way to something built on choice. Behind me, the Council chamber falls into a different kind of silence than the one I remember from 3 years ago. Not the silence of judgment, but the silence of an old order, finally, quietly, stepping aside. Ahead of me, the galaxy stretches out wide and open, full of possibility, and for the first time since I can remember, nobody is waiting to tell us how far we are allowed to go. I smile the whole way home.